More than 4 centuries had passed since the Hebrews arrived in Egypt seeking refuge during the famine in the time of Joseph, the son of Jacob. But the generations changed, and so did the context. The pharaohs who once saw the Hebrews as allies now saw them as a threat. The Hebrews, numerous and strong, were subjected to slavery, forced to perform exhausting work on the pharaoh's constructions. Oppression and injustice were suffocating them, but they still kept a small flame of hope alive in the God of their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In the midst of this oppression, Moses, a man raised in the Pharaoh's palace but aware of his Hebrew roots, fled after defending a brother in faith. Years later, in the desert, Moses had an encounter that would change his life and the history of his people. The encounter with the burning bush, where God revealed his mission to him. "I am who I am," said the Lord, sending Moses back to Egypt with the difficult task of freeing his people from slavery. Moses returned to Egypt and confronted the Pharaoh, demanding in the name of God, "Let my people go." But the Pharaoh refused, hardening his heart. Thus began the 10 plagues, each a reminder of God's power and a judgment against Pharaoh's obstinacy. The water of the Nile turned into blood, frogs flooded the land, lice and flies plagued the people, and the livestock was decimated. Even so, the Pharaoh did not relent, even after the hailstorms, the total darkness, and the plague of locusts. The 10th and final plague was the most devastating, the death of all the firstborns in Egypt. That night, known as Passover, the Hebrews painted the doors of their homes with the blood of a lamb, following God's command so that the angel of death would pass over them. Finally, broken and devastated by the last plague, the Pharaoh agreed to let the Hebrews go free. On a night of chaos and hope, hundreds of thousands of Hebrews organized and began to march, carrying their possessions and the memory of centuries of oppression with them. They crossed the desert guided by Moses, who with unwavering faith led them to the promised land. But the journey was not without dangers. Soon the Pharaoh, regretting having let them go, sent his army in pursuit, determined to bring them back or annihilate them. The Hebrews found themselves trapped between the Egyptian army and the Red Sea with no apparent escape. It was then that one of the most remembered miracles in the entire Bible occurred. Moses, in obedience to God, raised his staff over the sea, and the waters parted, creating a dry path for the people to cross. The Hebrews crossed over while the Egyptians pursued them. But when the pharaonic army was in the heart of the sea, the waters closed, destroying the soldiers and freeing the Hebrews once and for all. The Exodus not only represents a physical departure from Egypt, it is a spiritual journey, a transformation in which the Hebrews went from being slaves to becoming God's chosen people. But the journey didn't end in the Red Sea. In the desert, God continued to instruct them, showing them his power and patience. He gave them manna to feed them, water from the rock to quench their thirst, and delivered the tablets of the 10 Commandments to them on Mount Sinai, establishing an eternal covenant. This 40-year journey was also a test for the Hebrew people, in which they learned to depend completely on God and to forge their identity as a nation. Many faced doubts, nostalgia for the security of Egypt, and temptations to stray from the faith. God guided and corrected them, shaping their character and teaching them that true freedom is not just the absence of oppression, but living in obedience and communion with Him. Finally, after years of pilgrimage and learning, the Hebrews reached the threshold of the Promised Land, a land flowing with milk and honey, just as God had promised. Although Moses did not enter the promised land, his leadership and faith paved the way for the people, and his legacy of obedience and courage continues to this day. The Exodus from Egypt is more than an ancient tale. It is a universal story about the power of freedom, the importance of faith, and the path we all must take to find our identity and purpose. It reminds us that, although the path is full of obstacles and sacrifices, God's promise will always be fulfilled.